Ladies and gentlemen, poverty is not always an accident. It is not always the fruit of laziness or the harvest of irresponsibility. It is not always the consequence of poor choices or bad timing. It is sometimes the blueprint of a system that was never built for the many, but only for the few. A system designed not to lift the weak, but to keep them weak, not to feed the hungry, but to keep them dependent, not to educate the masses, but to entertain them into silence, while chains are fashioned around their futures in boardrooms and behind closed doors, far from the eyes of the very people who sweat. There stains it. There are those who profit when you have nothing. There are those who rise when others sink deeper. There are empires that feed on despair and corporations that expand on the backs of broken neighborhoods and schools stripped of funding and families forced into cycles of debt. Dependency and the lie is whispered from every corner that this is just how the world works, as though injustice were gravity and greed were a natural law. But I tell you, no, it is not nature. It is design. It is policy. It is deliberate. And it is wicked, they say. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. But first, they make sure you have no boots. They say chase your dreams while building fences around opportunity. They hand you a shovel and call it a ladder while they ride elevators built by your hands and your labor and your prayers. And they smile and speak of freedom while locking the doors from the inside and putting bars on invisible prisons made of interest rates and rent hikes and minimum wage paychecks that barely let you breathe. And while the world scrolls and the news cycles spin, the children grow up thinking this is normal, that this is just life, that some are born to earn and others are born to owe, and slowly the hunger for more becomes the fear of losing what little you have. And so the game continues generation after generation, because it is easier to manage the poor than to empower them, easier to medicate them, easier to blame them than to change the system. That keeps them exactly where they are. But let me tell you today, the spirit behind this system is not of heaven. That is not of righteousness. It is not of justice or mercy or love. It is a spirit that fears the awakening of the masses. Masses, spirit that shakes from truth to spirit, and spirit that trembles when the poor realize they are not powerless, that they are not voiceless, that they are not worthless, that their poverty was never proof of failure, but often the evidence of sabotage. For when one man controls the bread, he controls the hunger. And when one voice controls the story, he controls the history. And when one power controls the purse, it can buy the silence of prophets and the worship of kings. But there comes a time when the silence is broken and the veil is lifted, and the poor begin to see not only the prison they are in, but the path that leads out. And that path is not paved but with truth, with courage, with unity, and the fire of a people who refuse to die quietly. You see, the system can handle your poverty, but it cannot handle your purpose. It can handle your need, but it cannot handle your knowing. Once you begin to see how the dots connect, how the ceiling was built before the floor, how the trap was baited with just enough to keep you from running then, and only then will you understand that poverty is not just about dollars and cents. It is about keeping souls small. It is about robbing a man of his belief that tomorrow can be better than today. And as long as the lives, poverty will persist. But if you rise, if you speak, if you refuse to bow your head and accept crumbs from a table you built, if you ignite the hearts around you and lift the veil off just one more soul, then the engineered poverty that has choked your people will begin to tremble, because truth is the one thing oppression cannot afford, and freedom the one thing they cannot engineer. These systems are like invisible chains wrapped around the necks of the poor and marginalized, tightening with every law passed that favors the rich. Every tax break given to corporations and every loophole exploited to keep the wealth flowing upwards and not downwards, and they disguise themselves as fairness and meritocracy, while the truth is clear for those who dare to see that the game is rigged, the deck is stacked, and the rules are written to protect privilege and deny opportunity. Wicked systems keep wealth in the hands of a few by controlling education and access to knowledge, by limiting who can rise and who must remain stuck, by closing doors before they can be opened, and by telling the powerless that success is solely their responsibility, ignoring the broken ladders and missing rungs that should have lifted them higher, but instead leave them falling deeper in despair and dependence on a system that profits from their defeat. These systems thrive on distraction and division, by turning people against each other, by using race, class, and fear to fracture solidarity. so that the many never unite to challenge the few who hold all the power, because the divided people are easy to conquer and easy to control. But when the oppressed see through these lies and rise as one, the foundation of these wicked systems begins to tremble and crumble. Wicked systems keep wealth in the hands of the few by exploiting labor and natural resources, by draining communities of their life and spirit, while filling the pockets of the elite, and they paint the faces of greed with smiles of progress and development, while the real cost is paid in broken families, neglected schools, and poisoned environments that no amount of money can truly repair or replace. They keep the poor poor and the rich richer by denying access to health care, housing, and fair wages, by creating obstacles that seem insurmountable but are by design. And they celebrate individual success stories as proof that the system works, while ignoring the millions left behind in the shadows of inequality and injustice. And they silence voices that demand change with threats and intimidation and lies that mask the truth. Wicked systems keep wealth in the hands of the few because they fear what will happen if the power shifts. If the people awaken to their strength, if the oppressed demand justice, if the walls of privilege come crashing down, and they will fight fiercely to maintain their grip, to keep the chains fastened and the voices muffled. But history shows us that no system built on injustice can last forever, because the cry for freedom is louder than the roar of oppression. Therefore, the call is clear, the rise to awaken, to unite, to break the chains and tear down the walls that keep us divided and impoverished, because wicked systems will not surrender willingly. But when the many claim their power, when the voices of the poor and marginalized rise as one, then the wealth of nations will begin to flow not to the few. To all, injustice will roll down like a mighty river, bringing life and hope to every valley and hill, and the promise of a future where no one is left behind or forgotten. True poverty is not just the absence of money, because a man can be rich in wealth and still poor in spirit. And there is a poverty that no amount of currency can heal, a poverty that creeps in the heart when dreams are crushed and the light of tomorrow grows dim. And it is this poverty that binds the soul in chains far heavier than any wallet can carry. Hope a man is lost without vision, he stumbles and falls, and without hope there is no fire to keep the heart beating strong through the darkest night. You see, poverty of the spirit is a thief that steals joy and courage. It whispers lies that say you're worthless, unworthy, unseen, and unheard. And it convinces the weary that the struggle is in vain and that the future holds nothing but more pain and disappointment. And so many live like this every day, trapped in a prison not made of bricks but of broken dreams and silent despair. And they walk through life shadows of themselves, never daring to believe they are called for greatness or destined for freedom. True poverty is when a mother looks into the eyes of her child and cannot find a future worth hoping for, when a father works 2 jobs and still wonders if his family will eat tomorrow, when a young mind is told over and over again that education is for others, not for them. And so the flame of ambition is snuffed out before it even has a chance to burn bright, and the cycle spins on. And I'm like a wheel of sorrow that never stops turning, because hope was never planted and faith was never nurtured. It is easy to count money, but much harder to measure hope, and yet hope is the currency of the soul, the lifeblood of progress, and the anchor in the storm, because when hope is alive, a man can rise from the ashes of defeat and walk boldly into the future. And when hope is alive, a community can break free from the chains of poverty and build a new world where every child can dream and every dreamer can soar. And this is why the enemy fights so hard to steal hope, because he knows without it all else crumbles like dust in the wind. True poverty is a silent killer that wears the mask of resignation and despair. And it creeps into homes and hearts through neglect, injustice, and lies. And it grows in the absence of justice, in the presence of cruelty, and in the shadow of indifference. And so the battle is not just for food and shelter, but for hope and vision and love, because these are the weapons that break the chains and lock the path to freedom and transformation. When hope is lost, poverty multiplies, but when hope is found, miracles happen. When one soul dares to believe that tomorrow can be better than today, when one family refuses to give up, when one community rises up to demand change, then the darkness begins to break and the chains begin to fall. And this is the power that can turn deserts into gardens and barren fields into harvest, because hope is the seed of all resurrection and revival. Therefore, we must be the bearers of hope. The lights in the darkness, the voices that cry out that no one is forgotten, no one is beyond redemption, and no one is too far gone, because the hand of God reaches into every valley of despair and lifts the fallen, and because hope is the gift that keeps on giving, the spark that ignites revolution and the heartbeat of freedom. And so we must plant hope in the hearts of the poor and the broken and the weary, and nurture it with love and truth until it becomes a fire that cannot be extinguished. And when that fire burns bright, poverty will lose its power, and the children who once knew hunger will know plenty, and the families who once trembled in fear will stand strong. And the nations that once bowed under the weight of despair will rise up in joy and freedom, and the song of hope will echo from every hill and valley, because true poverty was never about lack of money, but the absence of hope, and when hope lives, poverty dies forever. The call of God is to set the captives free, and not just from the bondage of sin that changed the soul, but from the cruel cycles of exploitation that keep the body and spirit enslaved generation after generation. And this is a calling that shakes the foundations of every system built on greed, injustice, and oppression. Because true freedom is not only forgiveness, it is restoration. It is breaking every chain that holds a man captive and lifting him into the fullness of life that God intends for all his children. For too long, the captives have been told that their chains are their cross, that their suffering is their destiny, that poverty and pain are to be accepted and endured. But the voice of God cries out against these laws, saying no more. And the gospel is not just a message of salvation from declaration of war against every power that steals dignity and hope and peace from the lives of the oppressed. And this war is fought not with weapons of hate, but with the truth that sets free, and the love that restores, and the courage that rises up to demand change. The captives are not only those bound by addiction or guilt, but those trapped in cycles of poverty, denied education, exploited by unfair wages, and locked behind invisible bars of systemic injustice. And God's call reaches to every corner where oppression rules, to every heart burdened by despair, to every soul longing for justice. Liberation, because his kingdom is a kingdom of freedom, and his law is love. And when he sets his people free, no chain can hold them back. To break these cycles requires more than charity. It requires justice more than pity. It requires power and commitment. It requires a generation willing to stand against the forces of exploitation and greed, willing to speak for the voiceless and act on behalf of the oppressed, willing to build a new world where no one is left behind and no one is forgotten. And this is the revolution of the Spirit, a revolution fueled by faith, hope, and unyielding love. And God's call to freedom is also a call to responsibility, because those who have been given much must give much. Those who have been set free must become the liberators for others. And so the chains that once bound us become the very tools we use to break the chains of others. And this is the power of the gospel, the power to transform lives, to heal communities, and to overthrow every stronghold of injustice and despair. The call to set captives free is not easy. It demands sacrifice, courage, and perseverance. It requires us to confront uncomfortable truths, to challenge powerful systems, and to love whom society often forgets or condemns. But it is a call that echoes through the ages, a call that has changed the course of history and continues to call forth warriors of justice and mercy in every generation to carry the torch of freedom high. When we answer this call, we become part of God's redemptive story. We become agents of change, messengers of hope, and builders of a future where freedom is not a dream, but a reality, where every person can walk in dignity and purpose, where the chains of exploitation are broken, and the captives walk into the light of new life. And this is the promise of the gospel, the promise of a world made new, where justice flows like a river and mercy covers the earth. So let us rise up with boldness and faith. Let us embrace this holy calling with passion and determination. Let us become the hands and feet of freedom in a world still shackled by sin. Exploitation, because the call of God is clear and unstoppable, to set the captives free, to proclaim liberty to the oppressed, and to bring the light of hope to every dark corner, until every chain is broken and every captive stands in the fullness of God's love and grace. The people perish to live. Knowledge, because when truth is hidden, when lies are spoken as facts, when history is erased and justice is denied, the hearts of men grow cold, and the spirit of a nation weakens, and ignorance becomes a cage that imprisons millions, leaving them vulnerable to deception and oppression. And so knowledge is a light that must shine into the darkest corners, exposing every lie and revealing every injustice, because without knowledge there is no awakening, and without awakening there is no change. But knowledge alone is not enough, because it is one thing to know the truth and another to live by it. And so many have been given knowledge, yet remain silent or paralyzed by fear and uncertainty, because knowledge without action is like a lamp placed under a basket hidden from the world. And so the danger remains, the chains remain, and the people continue to perish, because knowing what must be done is only the first step on the road to freedom. Bold action is the fuel that drives change, the courage that breaks the silence, the strength that challenges the status quo, because it takes more than understanding to dismantle wicked systems. It takes bravery to confront those who profit from injustice. It takes perseverance to fight when the battle seems endless, and it takes faith to believe that victory is possible even when the odds are stacked against us. And without bold action, knowledge becomes a wasted gift, and a voice unheard. The history of every great movement of liberation is marked by those who refused to sit idly, by those who took knowledge and turned it into revolution. Those who stood up when others sat down, who marched when others whispered, who spoke truth to power. Others cowered in fear because the world is not changed by ideas alone, but by people willing to risk everything for justice and freedom. And so bold action is the heartbeat of transformation. We must not only teach, but also empower, not only inform, but also inspire, not only expose the lies, but also build the new reality, because the kingdom of God's and where faith without works is dead and love without sacrifice is shallow. And so the church, the community, and every believer must rise up to be agents of change, to be warriors of truth, to be builders of a world where knowledge leads to liberation and justice. Bold action looks like standing with the oppressed, speaking out against corruption, marching for the voiceless, demanding fair wages, fighting for education and health care. Looks like refusing to accept the crumbs while others feast. It looks like breaking the silence on injustice, even when it costs dearly, because the cost of inaction is far greater, and the people continue to perish without bold action. The cycle of poverty, ignorance, and despair only tightens its grip. And so the call rings loud and clear, the call to not only learn, but to act, to not only understand, but to resist, to not only dream of a better world, but to build it with our hands, hearts, and voices, because knowledge without action is a spark that never ignites and a river that never flows, and the people perish still waiting for the day when courage overcomes fear, when truth overcomes lies, and when action overcomes apathy. Therefore, let us rise with knowledge burning in our hearts and boldness in our steps. Let us be the ones who refuse to let ignorance rule, who refuse to be silent in the face of injustice, who refuse to perish when the power to change lies within our hands. And as we move forward with courage and faith, the darkness will tremble and the chains will fall, and the people will rise to walk in the freedom they were always meant to have. And this is the promise of God's kingdom, a promise that calls us to knowledge and bold action without him.